James A. Lindsay, who is an author who's previously written a book which was out on Owner's Books. Well, he's written 2 books, but the last one was ... Infinity Plus God Equals Folly, which had a forward by the late Victor Stenger. And since then, he's been working on another project for another publisher, and I'll let him introduce himself. He is... I will add that he is a mathematician by trade, as well as getting involved in philosophy and the philosophy of maths, as well as the philosophy of religion. So, James, over to you. Welcome to A Tippling Philosopher, and explain your project.
My project is another book, which I have one, so I'll hold it up if I can. Can we see it?
Oh, that is a pretty nice looking book.
That is a book. It is Everybody is Wrong About God is the title. It has a foreword by Peter Boghossian, a manual for creating atheists fame. And it is a pretty hard stab directly at changing the conversation about God and religion and theism. My goal, in fact, is to remove most of the philosophical discourse and replace it with more real-world kind of psychological discourse.
So in some sense, you're moving from the philosophy of religion to the psychology of religion, as well as concentrating on sort of pragmatic societal, issues involving God.
Right. Well, of course, also psychology being a soft science requires a lot of good interpretation to be of any use. And so I don't think that the psychology of religion and the philosophy of religion, although philosophy of religion kind of means a specific thing, I don't think that the two are really that distinct from one another. They kind of are tied together, because to understand the psychology, we have to have good philosophy. And so, I mean, the book is heavily based on psychology of religion and psychology of people, therefore, and it is really, though, philosophical in tone. The point of the book, if it has one other than just changing the conversation, is to recognize that when people who believe in God talk about it, is that God means something important to them, and the book tries to figure out what that is.
Sure. So in a sense, the book is looking at the function of God in a social and psychological sense. But before we get onto that, I was wondering if you could elucidate where the conversation is now and where you would like the conversation to go.
Sure. I'm not 100% sure where the conversation, and when I say the conversation, or you say it here, it means about God or theism generally. I don't know exactly where that is, because I believe it's in flux. The preliminary responses that I've had to podcasts or essays that I've written about this book so far are people now that have actually gotten the book, which isn't supposed to be available till December 1st, but Amazon does what it does and ships things early sometimes, as in this case. People are telling me that a lot of people are telling me that it's meeting them where they already are, and that they're more than ready to move on from what has been the conversation, which has been what we often see criticized as the new atheism conversation, which is criticizing religion in terms of how harmful it is, and criticizing religion in terms of its lack of philosophical merit. And I would like to see the conversation. Of course, we need to still decry the harms that are being generated by religion, but I would like to see the conversation switch, if at all possible, to one where we are trying to create a more welcoming space for positive conversations with people who believe, and trying to help everybody, people who believe and people who don't, find and meet the needs that a lot of people turn to religion in order to meet, without having to turn to a belief in a deity, which is ultimately a mythological thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because in a sense, the philosophical discussions concerning God and the idea of new atheism and atheism skepticism is actually reaching some kind of maturity. We've seen conventions, skeptical conventions, taking off and becoming really, really popular. We've seen big names like Dawkins and Harris and Dennett and Hitchens become, you know, household names. We've seen whole communities come together and split up, and as atheism and skepticism is on the agenda. TV channels are always talking about it. Fox is talking about it all the time. And in a sense, certainly from my point of view, especially as a philosopher of religion myself, is that you get to a point where you've done all the philosophical arguments, and it's kind of like we've matured past the does God exist or not. I'm pretty sure that we've got the conclusion, and therefore it's a conversation of, well, what next? And I get the sense that that's what the psychology of religion helps us to understand, by knowing what function God plays. And then the conversation can naturally move on to, well, what do we do about this? And I think your book is coming at just the right time, because I think that there is this sense of maturity in the movement. Actually, we can see skeptical conferences and things starting to lose membership now, as people are kind of past the excitement of this new idea that's not new at all, right? The new idea of skepticism and atheism and the lack of God, right? So people have moved past that. And now it's a case of, we need something to fill that void, perhaps, that God once filled.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly what's going on. Is that, you know, you mentioned several names that have become household names, which, where I live, that's not exactly true. You may not believe it, but about 50% of the people I talk to know who Richard Dawkins is. And if 10% know who Sam Harris is, I'd be surprised.
So I guess what I'm saying is they're household names to the skeptical movement, right? So it's the skeptical movement that themselves are now happy with where they're at, and therefore it's time to move on.
Well, what's become a household word for everybody, not a name, but a word, is atheism. Everybody has to recognize, everybody, at least in the developed world or the Western world, whatever the right wording for that is, has to recognize now that atheism just is a thing. There are a lot of people who don't believe in God and who no longer feel like there's this, you know, keep it behind closed doors quietness about it. And I think that the past decade or so has been really instrumental in that. And now people are ready, now that it's become just a part of, as I've put it in the book, I put it as, it's become part of the cultural furniture. We're ready, you know, to use that furniture or move on or do something. But it's become comfortable that maybe people don't like it, but there are some people don't like it, but it's become comfortable that there are people who don't believe in God pretty much everywhere.
So, having read an early manuscript of your book and really, really enjoying it as well, let's start from the beginning. So you talk about getting past the conversation and getting past the label of atheist and atheism. So in fact, that because God refers to something, a function that this abstract idea of God presents, in fact, in some sense, we're not atheists. That we have needs, and this idea of God fulfills those needs. So therefore, and this is the idea that we're wrong about God, because it's not that God doesn't exist. It's the features that God entails do very much psychologically exist. Would that be right as your opening premise?
Yes. The basic idea there is that while a deity called God doesn't exist, not at all, and atheists are right about that, there is some idea or collection of ideas kind of operating at the psychological and social level that certainly does exist, and lots of people call it God. And so in a way, there is a thing called God that exists in the same way that things like calculus exist, in the idea sense of existing. And this thing is not just in existence for people, it's really, really important for the people who believe in it. It's central to the way they conceive of the world. And so I think it's going to be really important, if we're going to move forward, to kind of recognize that and meet those people where they are. Even if there's, I mean, I've been accused of it already, so I might as well embrace a degree of it. There's a little bit of this, I know better than you do what's going on here attitude, but that's the case all the time when you've studied something and other people haven't.
And also
the psychology of religion is,
yeah, I think particularly with the discipline of psychology, because you're unpicking why people do things, there's a sense of like, you know, you take away the mystery of human thought and human behavior, and people generally don't like that. But and so I can see that reaction.
well, yeah, that's the thing, is the mystery of human thought and behavior is exactly, some facets of that are exactly what the word God, or the idea of God, exists to fill in for people. And I like to say that it helps them meet certain needs and helps them ignore others, because I think that's actually what's ultimately going on, is that they're ignoring certain human needs by pretending that they don't matter by their religious beliefs, often in God.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite similar to your last book in some respects, that infinity may or may not exist. It might not, an infinite set of objects might not exist, but the idea of infinity is useful for doing other maths, right? And for looking at ideas. Right. And so it fits in. So we use infinity in the same way that God may or may not exist, but atheists would say that God doesn't exist. But we that's an idea that is useful, and it plays a function. So let's then move on to what that function is. What would you say are, say, for example, the 3 or 5 most important functions that God plays in society or for humans?
Actually, in the book, I referred to it as the Trinity. So 3 is pretty good. Okay. There are 3 main needs. But as you mentioned, my previous book, ... This is this book is the kind of logical follow-up to that. That book lays out pretty plainly that God really must be an idea if it can get that tied up with infinity. And so if God is an idea, the next step is, well, what is the idea? And what does it do? What's it for? And so here we have 3 main psychological needs that people turn to religious beliefs for. One of those is a need for attribution, which is the need to explain things. That includes a lot of categories like morals, purpose, phenomena in the world. The so-called God of the gaps, or creationism, speaks to that. We need to understand ideas themselves, abstract ideas and ideals, spirituality, things like that. All need some kind, whatever spirituality means. People obviously resonate with it. Lots of people resonate with it, whether every atheist on earth rejected it or not. Lots of people consider it to be really important. I don't go a day probably at all without hearing the word from somebody or seeing it on social media. So it's certainly important for people. All those things need explaining, and attribution is a formal term that describes giving explanations to things. So filling our curiosity about stuff we don't understand is one aspect of that. The primary reason, other than just being uncomfortable with not knowing something when we want to know it, that people believe in God, is for a sense of control. So needs for control are second in the list, according to psychology of religion. And the third is to establish and maintain social orders and social hierarchies, and to identify social groups under single banners. Now, all that ties back, as I mentioned, for attribution, to morals. And so I really do think that morals are probably one of the absolute core reasons that people use the term God. I'm not saying that they believe in God because of morals, but it's the way that people who do believe in God conceive of their morals. And then that becomes extraordinarily important in making sense of what people are doing. Religions are actually these objects called moral communities. And as I explain in rather tremendous detail in the book, God serves as a figurehead. And then, of course, as you actually helped me flesh out if you want a 5th reason, it falls under the need to explain purpose and for control. But the denial of death is an enormously important reason that people believe in God. It's probably, according to even, textbooks in the psychology of religion, it is probably the reason that religion
Yeah, and
persists.
I remember talking to you about this during the writing of the book, and just thinking, because I know there's a theory for those who might be watching and listening to this. There's a theory called terror management theory that would state that death brings about this feeling of terror, and you need to manage that, and the best way of managing that is in some way living beyond death, right? And therefore giving some kind of purpose to your life and some eternal life. But in that, there's lots of psychology wrapped up. So when you give someone evidence against their God, you're not actually, they won't be dealing so much with the evidence against their God. That what they'll be trying to deal with is the threat that you pose to their eternal life. And so therefore arguing about evidence and rational argumentation becomes very difficult, because it boils down to psychology. And if you're going to have a go at my worldview, you're actually challenging my eternal life, and I don't like that. I'm so afraid of death. So I think, yeah, I'd agree with you that death is hugely important as part of that. But it's also interesting to go back to morality and how that underpins so much. It's there's no surprise that when you see William Lane Craig or any debates between atheists and theists, the moral argument is one of the core pillars of that. And there's this. I mean, I've spoken to people who aren't even interested in philosophy, that they'll say, well, if you don't believe in God, how does morality work? It's literally like this intuitive belief that God underpins morality, and without God there just can't be morality.
That's exactly what I mean by saying that God's, one of its main functions as an idea is an object for moral attribution. People want to understand how morality works, where morality comes from, what it means, how important it is, how objective or concrete it is. And despite the best protests of moral relativists, there is a real sense that there are better moral attempts than others, and therefore some sense of at least partial objectivity in human morality. And people want to understand that. And so they, lacking a better way to do it, they come up with a mythological entity that handles it for them. And so when people like William Lane Craig, for instance, go up there and give the moral argument, they don't realize it, but they're really making a tautology, because in a huge sense, when they're talking about morals or the moral argument for God, what they are saying, or what they are doing, I should say, is using the word God as a stand-in for the existence, the idea, the existence of morals. And so when they go up and make the argument, what they're saying is morals exist because morals exist.
Yeah, I mean, this is the famous tautology that underpins criticisms of what's called the divine command theory of morality, which is God is necessarily good by nature, and therefore all commands that come from him are good. The commands aren't good because, lovingness and mercy aren't good because of what they bring about. They're good merely because God has them and commands them. And so you get this tautology that effectively looks like you can't appeal to moral reasoning, you can only appeal to God. So God becomes the currency of morality, which necessarily denies moral reasoning in the equation. So you can't say that is good because, unless it's that was good because it looks like it reflects God.
Right.
But anyway, that's going down the philosophical road. But it's interesting that the reason I concentrate on morality, because morality seems to be the currency of control and of social cohesion. Would that be fair to say?
It is the currency. I like that phrase. It is the currency of social cohesion, certainly. It is the currency of part of control. Part of what we want in control is the ability to control each other and society. Politics is, I guess we can call it a discipline. Politics is a discipline that exists specifically to try to deal with the complexities of that. But there are other aspects of control also. For instance, terrible storms, earthquakes, other catastrophes, natural disasters happen, and every single time you find people praying and wailing, or you find people praying and wailing ahead of time, thinking that if they just behave right, you see this all the time from the really crackpot Christians, for instance. They say that, oh, well, women were wearing short skirts, so God hit San Francisco with an earthquake, even though it's on a fault line and earthquakes happen there all the time.
We actually had I think it was an MP here, or certainly a councillor, that said that the floods we had in the West Country a couple of years ago were a result of the gays, and homosexuality caused all these storms. So,
I mean, the right wing right now essentially goes on this line like it's bread and butter, is that if we're not behaving rightly, God's going to get mad and wreck us, which is, therefore, if you behave rightly, God won't wreck us. That's a sense of gaining control over the natural world.
Yeah.
There are also other more personal aspects of the natural world, like, for instance, getting cancer. And of course, you watch people, their religion comes out of the woodwork all of a sudden when they become desperate. And there's an element of that.
This refers to the just world theory, which I would assume. So the just world theory is this kind of intuitive belief that everyone has. In fact, I wrote something on this because my partner, our twin sons, were rolling on a chair when they were 3 years old, and they smashed the oven door, and there were no oven doors left of that, so they didn't make it. And this is massive range cooker we've got. And she was like, and we eventually found one somewhere, and it was the last one you could possibly get, and it saved us like £1,500 to get this whole thing replaced. And she sat down and she said to me, that happened for a reason, didn't it? Because I reckon the oven was, if that hadn't have happened, if that hadn't have broken, this is before we could get the replacement door. So she was thinking we had to replace the whole thing. She's thinking that happened for a reason. I reckon the oven was going to have a fault, and we would all get carbon monoxide or gas poisoning or something. So actually the boys of that. So this idea that something bad's happened has to be balanced by something good. And that's intuitive in all humanity, irrespective of beliefs. So even atheists think, that must have happened for a reason, or, something that's just brutally unfair just can't happen. And then that's why heaven was invented, and that's why hell was invented, right? So I presume that would be in accordance with what you're saying.
It's in accordance, yeah. That's one of the two aspects of what I was saying. The other aspect is that if something bad happens to us, we just want to steal control back from the universe. If your body starts metastasizing cancer, you want anything. I mean, you'll drink any potion people, well, not you necessarily, but a lot of people will drink any potion any charlatan throws at them. They will, wail to whatever deity or do whatever rain dance or whatever other superstitious thing they think might help. And I mean, I understand where that's coming from. Desperation is desperation. But the kind of point that I make in the book, I don't have a solution for that other than trying to help people find other ways to do it. The point is, though, that when people say the word God, a sense of that level of control over their lives, or access to being able to do something, a ritual or a prayer or something like that, to access more control over their lives, is. So we talk about terror management theory with death. There's terror management theory with life too. Terrible diseases, terrible catastrophes, and people want control over that kind of stuff. And they have this mythological construct that in a lot of ways is no different from Poseidon or Zeus. You propitiate the right way, and all of a sudden bad things won't happen to you as much. Then on the other side of the coin, when the bad things happen anyway, well, there must have been a reason that's ultimately coming from a source of moral perfection and therefore good, to kind of blunt the trauma, the psychological trauma of dealing with the fact that something bad happened. So,
I remember when I was working through the manuscript with you, sort of reading the manuscript with you early on, and there was a quote from Hood and Spilker, one of the psychology of religion books that you refer to in your text. And I did a blog post of it actually, and talked about, and it was to do with terror management theory, I think. And I concluded at the end that atheism is just a bloody hard sell. When you're competing against all these things which might or might not exist, right? So saying you can have this eternal life, you can everything will be fine, all the injustices of this world will be balanced, and you'll have control, and look, here's something that will give you control and make you feel better about life and the horrible things in life, right? Atheism just has, well, shit happens. You know, there's a universe. That's a universe, and so I think then you start understanding why it's such a powerful potion, theism.
Sure, and I mean there are kind of three things I think that I can say about that. You bring up the terror management theory again, and these ideas of heaven, and you know, all the iniquities of life being balanced. Really, you know, it's a tough sell against that stuff, but if you look at it, the idea of heaven is really, you know, it's really a cheap, immature way to try to deal with death. It's like, you know, what are we going to do about this fact that we die? Oh, we'll just pretend it doesn't happen. Not only that, everything will be made right when it happens. So I mean, it's cheap and immature. It may be soothing, but it's the kind of, I mean, when I say things like the idea of God exists to help people ignore certain needs, that's really where I'm getting at the ignore side.
Yeah, because actually I've written on both heaven and hell extensively before, and both of them are fraught with so many quite obvious problems, not least the fact that they're quite digital, like either or, and yet humanity has a whole spectrum of behaviors and evils, if you like. And so to say like that lot's going to heaven and that lot's going to hell is just really, really simplistic, and that's just the first thing you can say about the many problems.
Yeah, you're 0.642 sigma in goodness, so you're in heaven, but you're 0.641 sigma, so fire for you. It's sort of ridiculous. Eternal fire. Yeah. So the second thing is that I think part of the reason atheism is such a hard sell, and I don't disagree, that would, I guess, be second and third, because I was going to say I don't disagree that it is a hard sell, and that the facts of life are hard, and part of growing up is just learning to deal with that.
Yeah.
But part of the reason, this is, I guess, then it's 2 and 3 are one idea here. Part of the reason that atheism is a hard sell is because, and I think it has been partly or mostly religious monopolization of this whole kind of dominion of thought, or this whole universe of thought. We don't have a whole hell of a lot of good materials to help us cope with, say, death, or articulate thoughts about morality. They're kind of there, but most people just think, oh, turn to religion. Why do we have to deal with this other stuff? And I think that creates a really good opportunity. So, you know, we were talking about how there's this sort of maturity leading to kind of stagnation of the so-called atheist communities or movements or whatever, and people are therefore probably looking for something different. I mean, this book that I wrote is meant to start conversations in a different direction, but there are activities that are really going to be valuable, and writing really eloquently, for instance, about death, doing research about the psychology related to dealing with death and dying, and therefore life and living. These things are going to be really, really huge areas where there's a lot of good stuff that's going to be needed. And I think that kind of, you know, if we ask the question, well, what now? That's sort of an answer, is like, we need to start looking at these things that people tend to turn to religion for: a sense of purpose in life, understanding their morals, a sense of control over circumstances, dealing with death, community cohesion, and looking for ways to start building and meeting those needs for people. I mean, not artificially, just because it helps everybody. And so my thought is, go ahead.
That I was just going to say that, but that pretty much wraps up the last part of this in as much as, well, what do we do knowing that God has these functions? Then what do we do with that? Which is what you've nicely started surmising.
Right.
And yeah, I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten it. But carry on.
My thought, generally speaking, is that people usually, and this is corroborated by evidence in the psychology of religion, people will choose natural explanations and a naturalistic worldview over a superstitious or religious one most of the time, when one is available, when they feel like they can trust it. And so if we are building the kind of societies and circumstances where people feel these needs are being met, what we're doing is we're opening up the space for people to leave their religions or leave their faiths more comfortably. We get them to a place where they no longer need it, and therefore, as it's full of baggage and nonsense, often they'll walk away from it more often. And there's evidence suggesting that's probably right. Look at the low religiosity of, say, the Nordic countries, or even Western Europe compared to the United States or Japan. These countries tend to do a lot better on social progress indexes and tend to do well with things like the Gini index, which measures social inequality. And I don't think the correlation between their low religiosity and their high levels of social health are coincidental. And I don't think the implication goes just one way. I think it goes both ways. These are kind of, as things get desperate, people become religious because they're superstitious now. They're not getting as good of solutions to their problems. So they become more desperate.
Isn't it? So,
yes.
Well, I think that's a really good word, desperation. When people are desperate, you have no control. And something I want to say earlier actually was the idea that certainty. Now, psychologically, we know that humans just don't like a lack of certainty. And when you're desperate as well, you just don't have the control over your future or feel like that. You don't have certainty over, or there's less certainty about where you're going, how healthy you will be in the very short term future. So yeah, this is why things like ISIS will breed so well in a war zone, which is full of poverty. I get so sad today when we hear of, so Egypt is very much reliant on tourism, and because of that Russian airline that's come down, loads of UK tourist airlines have pulled out of flying to Sharm el Sheikh in the Egyptian in Egypt. And so then you're thinking, well, that's going to lead to poverty, just like Tunisia. That'll lead to the gunfire on the beach in Tunisia. Then the country then starts getting a lack of money, poverty breeds, and people get desperate, and it's a breeding ground for religious fundamentalism.
Yeah, since these are interacting elements, they reciprocate off of each other. We have the potential for both vicious and virtuous circles. And so the downward spiral, follows kind of any perturbation or chaos, and is probably somewhat more stable in terms of what, applied mathematicians would call a stable equilibrium. Whereas the virtuous side takes more work, but it obviously confers far better results. Nobody wants to live in a war zone. Nobody in the world wants to live in a war zone. And if they had the choice. And so putting in effort to maintain, prosperity and peace and all of these things is something that people are definitely always going to be willing to work for. And so the fact that it takes work isn't necessarily a strike against it, but so this is a big one with control and sociality coming together. Knowing, for instance, that if, for lack of a better term, if shit goes wrong, that the community is the thing that's going to come together and make things better, with or without prayer. And we can have a long discussion as to how prayer facilitates and hinders that, because it does both. But with or without prayer, the community is what's going to come together. It's ultimately, as much as people grumbled about them following the Katrina hurricane in 2005 in New Orleans, it was ultimately organizations like FEMA and other people coming together that did what has been done to pull that community out of the literally mud. And it will always be people. If a terrible storm destroys a neighborhood or wrecks crops, you suddenly see people becoming more open and sharing. Well, I mean, look what just happened in Paris. People literally that night started opening their homes to complete strangers in the midst of one of the most terrifying things that's happened in a long while. Why? Because people start to help each other when something happens, and that's what ends up putting things back together, is people. And the more we understand that, the more we are in a space where we don't have to turn to belief in God to deal with it, because we can turn to each other. We can ask our neighbor for help, or we can ask if we have functioning emergency responses or government agencies, not to put everything on the state, but having a good infrastructure and emergency response system really cushions the blow.
What you mean, that sending them solar powered Bibles isn't going to do the job?
It does. I don't think
like
so.
Haiti.
Yeah.
Yes. So just to finish up here. Um, so you've rushed through, obviously because we don't have too much time, the
Sure.
idea that God represents a function. The function is broadly psychological and has these different elements. Your book is a conversation starter. It's not a conclusion necessarily about, and so therefore this is what we must do. It's more like, so now that we've got this groundwork in place, now that you're starting to understand the psychological function that God creates or God fulfills, it's a question, what do we do about this? And you broadly set out a few things which you've touched on there, some of them. So what would you say would be a couple of the key things that society can do to move past the discussion, to change the discussion, to move on to providing that psychological function from secular means?
Okay, so I'll talk about two things since you said society. Um, I'll talk about what societies can do and what people can do. And so I'll do people first. What people, like individuals, can do is start trying to get the notion of God right. That's what this book is about. If you understand where people are coming from when they're talking about God, or have the means at least to start tapping into where they're coming from, then you're going to think about the topic, you're going to converse about the topic, you're going to petition about the topic differently. And I don't think there's a prescription of what to do. It's just learning to think differently about the topic and then following what comes naturally. So that's what I think individuals largely should be
do you
doing.
mean becoming more psychologically literate in some sense?
That, and to just recognize that when people are appealing to God, that they are really appealing to the fact that they're trying to figure out how to meet certain needs
Yeah.
that can be met in other ways, as the atheists and atheistic religions, like Jewish atheists, most Buddhists, etc., kind of prove is possible.
Yeah.
You don't need a God in order to meet these kinds of needs, or even to have a religion. On the societal level, the evidence of countries like Japan and Sweden and Norway and so on really tells us that the more functional our societies become, and I don't necessarily mean this, how progressive things have to be. I'm just talking about pretty basic stuff. We need good infrastructure. We need good emergency response, stuff like that. The more functional our societies become, and therefore the stronger and more secure, and I don't mean, powerful in the sense that makes what Americans call libertarians quake in their boots. But the stronger, stable is a good word, yes. The more stable and functional our governments therefore become, the better we're going to do in terms of being able to move away from superstition. I think as long as we are in situations like we have in growing in the world right now, where maybe it's the culmination of neoconservatism has squeezed everybody to broke makes desperate, and budgets keep getting cut, and now a fire happens and we don't know if the fire department's going to be able to afford to put it out. And I mean, stuff like this scares people witless, and it should. And as long as that is the case, people are going to turn to other means to meet their needs for control and understanding and things like that. And so as long as, I think one of the biggest things that needs to happen is that people really need to support political candidates within, whether they're conservative, whether they're liberal, that doesn't matter as much. But ones who are genuinely interested in community building and infrastructure maintenance and creating stable, not what, American conservatives scream and cry about, the so-called nanny state. We don't need necessarily to be taken care of, but we do need the role of a government is to provide fundamental protections for its citizens. At the very least, that's what a government should be doing. And so by creating and facilitating that, societies get better, and the need or belief in God drops. So I think that everybody who has a mind toward wanting those kinds of goals, even if the goal isn't to shake anybody out of religion, but just to secure secularism, then we really need to be pressing for, electing candidates. Like I said, conservative liberal is less material here than is their commitment to making sure the society builds in a functional way, which sadly, maybe depending on the country, Sweden, it may not apply, but in the United States for certain, It will involve raising taxes. I mean, it has to be paid for somehow. And having a knee-jerk reaction away from that isn't going to do it, and it's keeping people reliant on superstition. And this is a really humanist point. Keeping people reliant on superstition isn't giving them an alternative that's working. It's giving them a salve that's I mean, it's like rubbing mud on it. It doesn't do any good. It's literally giving them nothing for their money, in a sense. And so
but makes them feel better. It's like homeopathy, isn't it? You know, they get this medicine which has no real medicinal value, as in there's nothing, no active ingredients, right? But I think that's great. That's good.
I mean, the difference here though is
active ingredient, but yeah. So there's no active ingredient, but they feel like there's an active ingredient and it's working, and it's just a bit kind of an illusion, right?
Right. Yeah, and the difference here though is, medically speaking, the placebo effect is an effect. It only works on certain kinds of subjective symptoms.
Yeah.
But I don't want to put in a plug for homeopathy, because I certainly don't agree with quack medicine. But if somebody just kind of feels off and they end up taking a homeopathic remedy and they get the placebo effect and feel better, something has been achieved.
Yeah.
And that's not even the case where you use something like a deity to pretend that nothing bad is going to happen. You're literally just kind of setting yourself up for failure.
Sure.
And if you pretend that your deity is going to protect your community or your house or whatever, then you're going to feel more inclined not to pay for the services that actually protect it. And I mean, this is just it's a disaster waiting to happen. And then when it does come, people stand there and wonder how it happened, and then say, as you said, bullshit like, well, it must have happened for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. We're probably going to have to leave it there, but it is. I've got a draft copy of the book on my computer, but I'm definitely going to have to get my hands on a real print copy. So thanks for talking about your book. It's an excellent book and a really good introduction into the psychology of religion as well as giving out these larger ideas too. So I advise anyone to go and get it. Do you have any closing comments? And hold up your book again, if you could.
Okay, hold on. Let's cover my face with it. No, let me get the angle right. So can we see it? Everybody is wrong about God. James A. Lindsay. And excellent. Forward by Peter Boghossian. And you can see, it is not a very thick book. The dimensions are nearly identical to an old DVD jewel case, and so it's not very long. I have been told by almost everybody that's read it so far, though, that what it lacks in length, it makes up for in density. So it is pretty dense reading. Yeah.
No, it's great. I really, really enjoyed it, because I personally, myself, being a philosopher of religion, I am moving. I mean, there is this sense that they're interwoven, just like morality is interwoven with the psychology of morality and the psychology of humans and that biological systems we have, and empathy and things like that. So there is this connection between psychology and morality. In the same way, exactly here, the philosophy and psychology are very much connected in you and woven beautifully in your book.
Well, thanks.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, and take care, and good luck with the success of your book.
Well, cheers.